Today on the podcast, we're up to part 20 in our series about Disney artist Herb Ryman. As regular listeners know, this is both the story of Herb Ryman and the story of how Walt Disney transitioned from films to creating an amusement park and other projects. In our most recent episodes, we've watched Herb Ryman work alongside Walt as the WED team designed Disneyland. We've also watched as Walt moved beyond his early film-based ideas for Disneyland as a theme park, and in today's episode, Walt is moving beyond Disneyland to create attractions and pavilions for large American companies at the New York World's Fair. During these same years, Ryman himself was at a turning point as he contemplated how those wonderful boyhood dreams he had of himself as an individual artist now related to his collaborative work at Disney. And so, if you're all ready, let's go. 5 or 6 years after Ryman started on Disneyland, he again felt some of his old restlessness. He liked the community of WED, he enjoyed his friendships there, but his work there wasn't always related to his own vision. It was more often related to the dreams envisioned by Walt Disney. "Sometimes at the Disney studio, I was allowed to be an artist and to be myself," he said. "Sometimes I had to be subordinate to the theme of the music being played." His work in the early 1960s was largely focused on developing attractions for the New York World's Fair. For the most part, these were massive undertakings, some of them far larger than any indoor attraction then at Disneyland. Initially, there were 3 projects: the Ford Magic Skyway, which presented a journey back in time to the beginnings of human transportation, in which cave people invented the wheel; the General Electric Carousel of Progress, which was an animatronic stage show that depicted the history and future of electrical appliances; and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, sponsored by the state of Illinois, which featured a complex animatronic of the 16th American president. Ryman worked on each of these projects. For the Ford Pavilion, he created images of cars gliding along an automated road into the sun-streaked vista of a futuristic city. He penciled out drawings of the evolution of the automobile. He also created renderings of the building itself before those renderings were handed off to an architectural firm. For the General Electric attraction, he did little, but he did create murals to be used as backdrops behind the stage. Ryman's influence was most pointedly felt in Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. Though initially Walt wanted to build a far larger attraction for the fair called One Nation Under God, a show once considered for Liberty Street at Disneyland, he couldn't find a sponsor willing to underwrite a presentation that featured multiple presidents. But with the assistance of Robert Moses, the president of the fair, Walt found a sponsor of sorts in the state of Illinois, who was willing to theme their pavilion around Abe Lincoln, a man who had lived for decades in their state. The project would pare down plans for the original Liberty Street show, featuring the Hall of Presidents, to a show that presented a single figure. The state of Illinois would present an audio animatronic of Abraham Lincoln in a presentation that was a direct descendant from those that Ryman had once explored for Disneyland. To Ryman, the reduction of an entire themed land down to a show with a single figure seemed like a waste. Gone was the Boston Village, gone was the Hall of Presidents, gone was the show that explored the development of the U.S. Constitution. One afternoon, Ryman asked what Walt was going to do with all of the leftover plans. "Oh, forget that," Walt said. "We're going to junk that." "Walt, you spent $500,000 on this. You're going to scrap it?" "Of course," Walt said. Ryman was confused how Walt could so easily alter course after insisting that he wanted some version of Liberty Street in Disneyland. Ryman asked why he'd changed his mind. "Well, I can change my mind," Walt said. Then he leaned in a little, as though to deliver the punchline of a joke. "My wife does it all the time." More so than the Ford and General Electric attractions, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln proved an ideal project for Ryman. The other two shows relied on visual comedy and even fantasy, whereas Lincoln was a depiction of a key moment in America's development, a combination of realism, history, and drama, which was a topical mix that had defined much of Ryman's work at MGM and Fox. He worked on concepts for this show for weeks. Ryman was now a middle-aged man moving into his early 50s. As such, he began to reevaluate his goals. During the past 25 years, he'd put together two large gallery shows designed to launch him into the world of fine arts. One focused on his trip to Asia, the other on the circus. Both had been well received. Neither had changed his life. When invited, he still showed his work in galleries and local exhibits, though now, more often than not, he was introduced as one of Walt Disney's artists. He saw quite clearly how his connection to Disney made the public look more closely at his work. These gallery shows and exhibitions were modestly attended, often by friends, by those central to the local art scene, and by people interested in the Disney studio. Still, Ryman heard the voice of his youth reminding him that he needed to support his own vision and not simply create art for a studio, not even one overseen by a friend. Whenever I got a little tired of being anonymous, he explained, I would go back to my own work. He still had personal projects, but none had the scope and scale of either his Asia paintings or his efforts with the Ringling Brothers. His earlier paintings, for the most part, communicated his vision and ideas to an imagined audience. His Asia watercolors were arranged to convey the complexities of life in China to a Western world. Likewise, his paintings on the circus were arranged with a historian's sense of purpose to preserve the era of the big top before it faded away. Now, he was interested in the ocean, a subject that represented a meaningful change in his work. In this, he wasn't primarily interested in how his paintings might communicate important cultural ideas to an audience. Rather, he was creating an artistic space to find a connection with the world around him. The purpose of painting was slowly changing. He wasn't painting primarily to elicit the praise of art critics and gallery owners. He was painting now so he could feel the nuances of the natural world around him. In short, he was painting to feel richer aspects of his own humanity. I've reached the point of life where I want to go to the source, he said. That's why when I go up to the ocean, big sir, I put my feet in the ocean. I feel the surf. Sometimes I get knocked down by the surf sitting there on those rocks. I'm living with nature. That's 300 million years old in that particular place. It'll be there long after I'm gone. During this period, he remained close with Walt. He still attended holiday gatherings with the Disney family. On weekends, he and his mother regularly ventured over to Bill Cottrell's house for dinner, often to find Walt and his wife Lillian there as well. Even after all these years, Ryman's mother, Cora, was still taken with Walt and believed that he had the ability to understand what people enjoyed and what they needed. Cora herself was now in her mid-80s. She was a slender, frail woman, a person whose narrow, pinched face suggested a life filled with struggle and accomplishment. Though she was slowing down, she still enjoyed dinner at the Cottrell's house. She also enjoyed making fried chicken for the Disneys when they came over to Herbie's place. One night, while discussing the 1960 presidential contest between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, Cora asked why Walt didn't consider the office for himself. You could run for president, she said, and you could be elected because everybody knows you. You wouldn't have to campaign. Walt considered this for a moment. Then a smile moved across his face. Why would I want to be president of the United States, he said. I'm the king of Disneyland. It was presented as a lighthearted joke, but it also expressed Walt's view of the world around him. He wasn't interested in remaking the world. He was interested in creating new worlds from the ground up, projects such as Disneyland that he, along with a few important artists, created together. For most of his adult life, Walt had tried to control what his studio made, from cartoons to the features, and then with Disneyland. Now with the World's Fair, he was looking beyond his park in Anaheim to other opportunities where his sense of control and presentation might create unique experiences for the world to enjoy. In many of these ventures, Herbie functioned as a lead, if not the lead, artist. During these same months, Walt, too, was showing his age. His hair, when it was not dyed for a TV appearance, was streaked with gray. His skin was wrinkled and sagging around his jawline and neck, and his walking pace at the studio was slower than it had been in previous years. On some days, he used an electric cart to travel from his office to the other side of the lot. Ryman, like others, put some of Walt's slowness down to smoking, the unfiltered cigarettes that for years had dangled between two fingers. He evidently made several attempts to quit smoking, Ryman explained, but just couldn't do it. Ryman noticed that Walt at times tried to cut back, exchanging his Chesterfields for smaller or less addictive brands. He tried the little black cigarettes, and he tried Turkish cigarettes, Ryman said, but he had to be preoccupied. Ryman noticed that Walt needed to do something with his hands as his mind worked through complex ideas. This always led Walt back to his beloved cigarettes. As a result, Walt's voice deepened, and around the studio, he was easily recognized by a persistent cough. His mind remained sharp, his personality warm and outgoing, his creative visions were drawn toward expansion and at times toward a sense of grandeur. But Walt, too, was aging. One of the issues that Walt was forced to reevaluate in the early 1960s was the relationship between WED, a personal company, and the publicly traded Walt Disney Productions. During the 1950s, WED employees had simply taken available offices at the studio. It was easy to justify their presence as they primarily worked on Disneyland, which was partially owned by Walt Disney Productions. When Disneyland assignments were slow, WED artists worked on films and TV shows for Walt Disney Productions. Imagineer Sam McKim developed concepts for multiple action sequences in Sleeping Beauty. Imagineer Stan Jolie created a set to represent Walt Disney's office on his weekly Disney TV show, and Ryman contributed to live-action productions, including The Shaggy Dog. Initially, WED employees were a relatively small group, easily housed at the studio, but as their numbers grew, largely to develop complex attractions for the New York World's Fair, it became more difficult to justify their presence at the studio. Though Walt hoped to eventually take attractions from the fair back to Disneyland, his initial agreement to create these attractions was wholly between WED and the companies themselves, an arrangement that made it difficult to claim that these new projects were strongly connected to Walt Disney Productions. Beyond issues of corporate connections, by the early 1960s, WED and Disneyland were stable companies and no longer needed the financial protection of the studio. For Disneyland, the 1959 expansion, with the Matterhorn, the monorail, and submarine voyage, brought crowds large enough to secure its future. For WED, lucrative contracts with GE and Ford not only made the company financially secure, but provided resources and partnerships that elevated the technical abilities of the company beyond that of other attraction design firms. In 1961, with part of the profits derived from the World's Fair contracts, Walt acquired a two-building office complex in Glendale, which was part of the Grand Central Industrial Park. The complex gave the employees of WED a place to finally call their own. The most noticeable architectural feature of this new building was an exterior canopy rising above its front door in the shape of a high-peaked triangle, an ornamental roof. The entrance was so similar to the triangular entrance of the very first International House of Pancakes, which had just opened 3 years earlier, 1 mile down the street from the Disney studio, that designers jokingly referred to this new WED complex as the Pancake House. The name made this new workspace seem like a place of play. Hey, they'd say to each other, let's head back over to the Pancake House. For Walt, the new complex reminded him of his early years in California, when his company had been small, when he'd known everyone at the studio, from lead animators to janitors. I like to come over here, he told one of his artists. It's just like the old studio. For those who worked at WED, the new complex offered a sense of freedom. Removed from the studio grounds and the oversight of its business managers, they eased more deeply into their identities as artists. Their attention was now wholly focused on the design of attractions, rather than being shifted as needed from Disneyland to TV shows and over to film. They had their own office parties, separate from those at the studio. Work here found its own rhythms, its own traditions. During lulls or periods of frustration, Ryman and others visited the Grand Central Bowling Alley, which was located next door, to have a drink and knock down a few pens. Work here was a mixture of play and adventure, very little of it tied to paperwork. Ryman relaxed into this community surrounded by friends. Unified under a common roof, WED employees gave each other nicknames. Ryman became Happy Herbie, according to Bob Gurr, the youngest engineer at WED. Herbie was very self-effacing when meeting new people, he explained, sort of brushing off any extra gushing that those who revered his art would display when first meeting him. But Herbie, only half joking, found ways to again suggest his importance in this fledgling company. If he was with Gurr when introduced to visitors, he'd let them know that Bob Gurr, who was brilliant with cars and ride vehicles, was the second smartest person in the world. Gurr, who had heard this joke many times, politely smiled. After taking in Gurr, the visitors invariably would turn back to Herbie and ask, who's the first person? Ryman looked at them with his soft, kind eyes, his lips turned up in a way that, even at his age, suggested a type of elfin charm. He'd wait for a moment, as though he were considering their question, trying to remember the answer. But then his eyes brightened as though he had finally located this difficult piece of information. I am, he said. The Pancake House, despite its name, didn't have a cafeteria, only vending machines. Because of this, as model maker Joyce Carlson recalled, we'd go out for lunch every day and have martinis. Artists Lee and Mary Blair would have 2 or 3. It was a place called Checks Cashed. Herb Ryman would come by. There was sawdust on the floor. We played pool in there. The hamburgers were 40 cents. So we'd order a hamburger and a martini. Every day we'd go in there and have martinis, but we still got our job done. Ryman loved this new world, its sense of autonomy, the way it felt like art school, with different work areas, rooms for painting, rooms for sculpture, and a very large room for model making. It was like art school, he noted, only one where all of the artists were 50 years old. Marty Sklar, a show writer for WED, recalled that Ryman enjoyed the sense of independence he found at this new facility. He would wander around and talk to people constantly. You wondered sometimes if he would ever do his work, Sklar said. But then he'd sit down and do more work and say more than 5 first-rate artists. Ryman let other managers know that only Walt could give him a deadline. If Walt asked for a set of drawings by the following day or even later that afternoon, Ryman would have them ready. But that courtesy was not extended to anyone else. Herbie was so very independent, Bob Gurr observed. Everyone knew that Ryman couldn't be pushed toward a deadline by anyone other than Walt, as he believed strong drawings and paintings required time and reflection. But one time, Dick Irvine, who oversaw WED, tested Ryman's limits. With a stern voice, he set a turn-in date for his work. In reply, Ryman offered Irvine a stern look of his own and then quietly pushed back his chair from his desk. As Gurr recalled, Herbie quietly put on his coat and left, not to return for many days. The incident solidified Ryman's unique role at WED. He was an artist who, aside from a request from Walt, needed time to complete art in his own way. As for Irvine trying his luck by setting another firm deadline, Gurr said that never happened again. As Ryman was a concept artist, he mainly worked on projects during their early conceptual phase, though he would contribute at times to their later stages as well. Once those early designs were approved, Ryman typically moved on to new projects, leaving other artists to finalize show stage elements, figure design, and attraction scripts. This meant that Ryman's primary work on the World's Fair was mostly finished in the early 1960s, even though other WED employees would focus on these attractions right up until the fair opened. During this period, Ryman was one of the few people able to work on new attractions and themed areas for Disneyland. One of the projects that Ryman started in 1961 or 1962 was a deeply revised vision of New Orleans Square. Years earlier, Ryman had worked on plans for a New Orleans Square, which back then told the story of the Louisiana Purchase. But over the past 5 or 6 years, Walt's ideas about New Orleans Square had changed. Walt's plans were now focused on dining and outdoor entertainment rather than on the lessons of history. This new concept was a descendant of 2 previous plans to develop mostly unused land beside the river. The first plan, called Rivertown, had offered an 1800s shopping district alongside the river, and the second plan was to be a recreation of New Orleans during the time of the Louisiana Purchase. But now the focus included more entertainment as a way of managing larger crowds that had recently arrived at Disneyland. "We wanted an area fronted on the river, the rivers of America," Ryman said, "and we thought New Orleans Square would fit into that area." The assignment was initially given to Ryman and another Disney concept artist, John Hench. As Walt was still focused on the fair projects, he directed Ryman and Hench to take design directions from Tommy Walker, director of live entertainment at Disneyland. "Well, Tommy," Walt said, "you go tell them what to do with New Orleans Square." Then he gave Ryman and Hench a look indicating that they should follow Walker's ideas. Walker's ideas were largely focused on how New Orleans Square, beyond shopping and dining, could meet the needs of park entertainment. Walker wanted a very large and elaborate bandstand as the area's centerpiece feature. Originally an area for shops, lunch, or dining under the stars, and a dance band were set in a bend of the river, Ryman explained. Then a traveling bandstand would retract between shows, and overhead a canvas shaded the guest from the hot sun. In this, Ryman envisioned a multi-purpose area that on less crowded days could be used as open space, and on more crowded days could be converted into a show area, perhaps large enough to present a well-known jazz band or a famous singer. The area's visual presentation outside of the massive stage area would be modeled on the original concept for New Orleans Square, specifically a historic French Quarter from the early 1800s, but the land would be dressed with a topical overlay that pointed to pirate lore. During the early 1960s, Walt envisioned two attractions for the square, both of which were related to pirates. On one end of New Orleans Square would be a walk-through museum where guests would pass by figures of pirates, some relaxing on a porch next to a treasure chest or parrot, others engaged in battle. At the other end of New Orleans Square would be the Haunted Mansion, which at that time was also being developed as a walk-through exhibit. The story inside of the mansion kept changing. There are at least a half dozen different early stories once earmarked for the mansion, but most of them revolved around a vengeful sea captain who had killed his wife after she discovered his secret identity as a pirate. To unify these two experiences, Ryman and Hench conceptualized a New Orleans Square that was dressed with icons related to pirate stories. According to Ryman, his designs featured a beached pirate ship, old chests overflowing with gold, jewels, and loot scattered around, which created a pirate atmosphere in the French Quarter. This would evoke not the New Orleans of contemporary America, but a vision of New Orleans from 150 years earlier, when legendary pirate Jean Lafitte wandered its streets. That is, at this point, the plan was to use the Louisiana Purchase timeline for the presentation of the French Quarter, only its purpose was no longer to present a vision of American history, but rather pure entertainment, culled largely from pirate stories such as Treasure Island, which remained one of the best-known live-action features created by Disney. But there were problems with this plan, the largest of which was Tommy Walker's inability to commit to a specific design. He continually changed his mind. The bandstand with a slide out like this, he told Ryman, but on the following day he'd say, no, maybe it's better over here. Walker also changed his mind repeatedly on how a shade system would work for those watching the show. After weeks of experimenting with concepts for New Orleans Square, Ryman and Hench grew tired of Walker's ambivalence. They also found themselves lured back to the World's Fair projects, largely to help with designs as wet artists worked to finalize and finish them. Some of Ryman's greatest contributions to the fair were for Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, which included many paintings that depicted America during the life of this president. But Ryman also worked on paintings for the GE Pavilion, a series of illustrations that depicted an ideal city in the future, a place called Progress City, a project in which Walt took a special interest, as it appealed to his overall sense of control and design. It was a city that, like Disneyland, could be perfected if someone with vision and money took empty land and built it from the ground up. But Ryman's focus was slowly moving away from Wed. His mother, Cora, who had appeared frail for years, was now approaching her final months. In ways, Cora was Herbie's strongest connection to family, far more than his sisters, a person he had lived with for most of his life. Her decline again told Herbie in very clear terms that life was arranged to take things he needed away from him. First his father, later friends like Irving Thalberg, and now her. Cora died on Wednesday, January 9th, 1963, at the Good Samaritan Hospital in Van Nuys, not far from where she had lived with Herbie for years. Herbie and his sister arranged for services to be held at a local church. But for the three Ryman children, particularly Herbie, the process of observing their mother's passing would take the better part of the year to absorb. In California, her body was cremated so that her remains could travel east. On Saturday, May 11th, a second service was held for Cora in Decatur, Illinois, where she had raised her children. After that, Herbie and Christine took their mother's ashes to Arlington Cemetery, where they were placed alongside the remains of their father, who had died 45 years earlier. When he returned to California, Ryman found a new emptiness in his house. All of those rooms, including the large open studio where he painted, would now be used by him alone. He felt a new prickliness between himself and his sisters, particularly Lucille, who after her earlier success had fallen on hard times. But at WED, Ryman felt the unique energy that surrounded artists focused on a project. He felt a warmth between himself and his friends, and as always, he felt a closeness with Walt, one of the most famous men in America, who wandered the halls of the Pancake House, a Chesterfield pinched between two fingers, as he looked enthusiastically at all of those projects being created around him. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan, at least right now, is to finish off an episode themed to Halloween to help enhance the mood for the final days of October. Also, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes, but the best reason to become a DHI subscriber over on Bandcamp is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.